Record. Alrighty, welcome to Esoteric Beat. I am very excited to have my old Twitter acquaintance, although I guess no longer a Twitter person, Emily Leon, who I first noticed your work regarding the controversial Theosophical painter Hilma of Klint. Or am I fairly describing this amazing person?
No, go ahead.
So I'm curious. I'm curious to know first of all, what is it about the work that you do that makes you feel good?
Like in general, all of my work are just things on Hilma of Klint.
Well, let's start in general. Why are you in this field in the first place?
So I think that the best answer to that question, and it's kind of a short one because even though I am academically trained in art history, I tend to focus a lot of my attention in a lot of other uh, disciplines, I guess. So a lot of what forms my own work is stuff from mathematics or theoretical physics or literature. So I think that what I like the most about what I do just in general from all things that I write is that it's peripatetic yet synchronic. And so it just combines a number of different ways of thinking, which I feel like captures a more holistic practice.
Can you expand? Can you unpack those terms, peripatetic and synchronic? That's interesting.
So, like, for instance, let's say that my art history, if I'm working on art history, there is, let's say, I'm basically working at the intersection of art history, religious studies, and science. But I also write and publish on sound and listening and orality. So I write liner notes for albums. I write essays on listening. Um, and then there's, the more, let's say, academic work that maybe would fall within in the realm of art history, but it's kind of altogether something else. Um, so just kind of weaving through multiple worlds of thought. So things that you wouldn't necessarily think would fit together end up working together quite nicely.
Okay, and let's talk about our subject now. So I was attracted to your work because, this show is about how esoteric studies is hard, let's say. It's sort of a hostile environment that we find ourselves trying to deal with, for example, the theosophical influences of Hilma af Klint in an art history field that is sort of not exactly welcoming to this sort of work. And you've been frustrated with that. You've got a bone to pick with the field. Tell me about this.
Yeah. So this is kind of this is going to be a little bit of a long response, and I hope that it sort of captures where I currently am with all of it. So, um, I think that when you and I first started sort of talking about having this conversation, you were asking me um, about the field or discipline of art history in particular being sort of resistant to the idea of occultism or esotericism, and whether or not I saw my work as addressing these problems or if I'm just trying to like wash my hands of them. And I really loved that question because the short answer is yes, I do still see my work as problematizing a particular purview of disciplinary art history. And that's really largely revolving or has largely revolved around this lack of appropriate vocabulary or methodology around modernism and the esoteric interests of late 19th and early 20th century artists, and the links that are very clear between art, science, and religion. And I think that I've been really dedicated for a long time to trying to deconstruct these dominant narratives and conduits of ideology within the field, um, in favor of more methodological pluralism and this idea of entanglement that so many things are enmeshed. And so I think that, are you familiar with Gordon White, the chaos
Oh,
magician?
little bit, yeah.
Okay, so I read his incredible book Animistic like years ago when it came out, and there's a comment that he makes, or a question rather, that he poses, where he just straight out asks, what would happen if we began to see relationally rather than hierarchically? And I think that that question sort of gets at the first part of your question in brevity about, do I see my work as addressing these problems? But to get more granular, I think that it's important to talk about this idea of washing your hands of these problems, because on the one hand, I don't think that that's fully possible, but I think that what I really want to stress is, and I'm laughing because it seems like I'm a contrarian, but I don't really have an interest in being a contrarian. I just naturally gravitate toward like what Terence McKenna would call the divine imagination, or I'm really interested in chaos, not something that degrades information or is the enemy of order, but that acknowledges complexity. And like flirting with that complexity is so important to me. And what new things can emerge from this complexity, from this chaos? So I think that what I've done with anything that would be perceived as academic is that I've like absolved myself from my own boundary. And that boundary, I think what I mean by that is, while in a lot of ways I'm working against disciplinary art historical conventions, theoretically, methodologically, I think for a time, I became entirely too focused on trying very hard to reach that conventional audience. And that it almost made me forget what compelled me to do this work in the first place. And so I think that while I'm often trying to confuse these distinctions and boundaries by reaching further afield in this attempt to really diverge from the normative practices of art history based on my interest in complex correspondences and the relationships between abstraction and science and esotericism, among many other things, I was still subconsciously, and probably still am, and I think this happens to everyone, wrapped up in one of the major conventions of the field, and all fields probably, and that's the writing. And what I mean by that is like the definable academic norms, like the uniformity of the writing, the tone, the conventions, the forms of argument that really often inhibit change. And when you're engaged, like myself, or at least hoping to be engaged in some type of activist sort of intervention, literally trying to eliminate these mechanistic models that we understand as kind of summing up what method is, it's like limiting and impossible, I think, to capture that conformity of the field while also trying to introduce alternatives to the very field that's binding you. So I think that I've just sought out alternative avenues that might be considered academic in some regard, but that sort of defy context categorization. And um, sorry if this is kind of long-winded, but this is like literally where I'm at and I feel good about it. But one of the last talks that I gave for a Modernist Futures conference a couple years ago, I very specifically avoided argument for argument's sake, and sort of refused the concluding paragraph in my paper, in my talk, and highlighted that, in order to sort of continue and muse on possible futures or what things could be, it seems really apt to kind of end with a couple open questions, to have a conversation, to really have a discourse around a particular topic, because knowledge is sort of operating on a continuum, I think. And so I think that one of my favorite living art historians, James Elkins, kind of he asks us to, quote, write something that forgets to behave itself, that fails to be dependable, that isn't good scholarship, but that tries to remember that even the most determinedly erudite and well-researched monograph is only writing. And so I'm going to take a moment to just quote a passage from a book I read a while ago. It's actually on methods, particularly within art history, and it's called Writing Art History, Disciplinary Departures. And in the book, they just straight out ask, what's with methodology, and claim that art history is yet to be invented, which I can't say that I necessarily disagree with. And they claim in the book that there is no other place for this invention than art history, and that one major means of such invention is just the reading of art history's writing. And so, in the academic world, you would call this historiography, intellectual history, just studying the development of ideas over time, the writing of writing. But it's more complex than that. They want to know, and I actually want to know, what else could art history be? And this is, I think, where imaginative intervention comes into play and sort of circles back to Hilma af Klint, because she's such a perfect case study in all of this. Because it kind of brings us to where we are now in disciplinary art history, especially in regard to Hilma af Klint and her, newfound sort of canonical fame, and what I'll call the moment that we seem to currently be in art history, where a lot of us have already been for like decades, in the esoteric turn. And it seems like the field is experiencing this kind of dramatic paradigm shift without really admitting it. Like they're kind of touching it, but not really fully diving in. And I think that just kind of thinking back on, one of the quotes that I mentioned earlier, like, let's allow our words to just misbehave and recover or reinvent what we've separated ourselves from, and bring the metaphysical foreground or back to the foreground, and remember that, this development of a professional field is young, like invented between 1800 and 1900. And so it can also be reinvented. And I think that this is where, my work really exists, in this sort of dissolving boundaries, or what Dr. Patrick Farmer might be like, a fieldless field. Um, I think I'm just more interested in more provocative kind of zones of exploring, like Donna Haraway's speculative facts, like allowing yourself to think in two places at once, or bridge making, weaving relationships between worlds. So I think that I don't really care to find any sort of validation from the field of art history. I feel like that's just so limiting intellectually, spiritually. Um, I think that I'm just more engaged in the world of art history at this point as like a cultural phenomenon. That's
So
all I got.
I feel like we can make this a little bit more concrete for our listeners if we can talk about. I'm interested in another intervention that I feel like I've seen on your lips is this idea of abstract art. So tell me more about Hilma af Klint as a case study of the problem of what is abstract art.
Oh, I cannot answer that question. I mean, abstract, as a definable term, in art history, non-objective painting or abstract painting is, not mimetic of nature. It's, um, abstracted from what we perceive as, reality. Um, and so that's kind of in summation how abstraction might be viewed. But that's a really loaded term. I think it has so many, just depends on how you're looking at it, I guess.
And when I look at the work of Hilma af Klint, I think like I'm not sure if this is abstract art. I think this is visionary stuff. Like this is something that this reminds me of something I've seen. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I think that I've felt like that for a long time. And I think that there's a lot of other scholars actually that feel similarly about that, where, there's kind of, um, I think that my perspective in particular is that the, trying to, um, let's say, that's like a context categorization where Hilma Klint suddenly became um, an abstract pioneer before Kandinsky, who's historically understood in the field to be the father of modernist abstract painting and like the progenitor of the spiritual dynamic in modern art. And then this lesser known Swedish artist pops into the field. And there was a lot of immediacy around canonizing her very quickly as the first abstractionist, an abstract pioneer, female abstractionist, etc. And um, I think that that is incredibly risky because although some of her work might be purely abstract, just color, so much of her other work is not necessarily accounted for sometimes, like her naturalistic works, her botanical works, her scientific works, and plus like the blending of ideas that the purely diagrammatic nature of her work. So Hilma af Klint, I think, is just very complicated, and for decades, more and more information and new perspectives on her will be continuously coming out and entering the field. But I don't disagree with you that I don't necessarily believe that, she's a purely abstract painter.
Now, another question in terms of like the sorts of interventions you might want to make. One thing that I find exciting about your work is the sort of access that you've had to the archive, and if I remember correctly, kind of like to like the way that she was socially situated, like the family. Can you tell us about that aspect of your work and how it plays into these questions of methodology and form?
Yeah, so just a little bit about how I kind of came to study Hilma af Klint, which I don't as much these days, but um, although I was familiar with her work long before I started writing about her, my scholarly work on her just kind of developed really by chance because I was writing on abstraction and spirituality and modern art, specifically on how the study of spirituality emerged incredibly slowly in art historical scholarship, that it was just written out of the historical record. And when conducting this type of historiographic research on the spiritual of modern art, you know, someone like Vasily Kandinsky, the Russian painter, really becomes a ubiquitous name. And prior to Off Klint's now canonical fame, like I said, Kandinsky had really assumed the position of both the father of abstract painting and was considered the progenitor of the spiritual and modern art. But I started to notice her name more at the time. And there were, this was pre 2018 Guggenheim show when she kind of exploded onto the scene. And so there was very little critical scholarship on her. And when art historians had addressed her work at that time, they had done so within, let's say, like the context of a broader analysis of spirituality in modern abstract painting, often focused on topics of gender, style. And then in relation to gender, the literature was highlighting her as an innovative female modern artist who produced these paintings before Kandinsky. And then she was also both praised and derided as well as a spiritualist artist, and often without full consideration of other aspects of her work. And then in extreme cases, she was just omitted altogether. And so this started to you know, how she was misrepresented was curious to me. And then I stumbled upon some conjecture around her relationship to the Austrian esotericist Rudolf Steiner, and a meeting that they had had in 1908 where scholars had focused on this oft-repeated claim that he negatively impacted and influenced her works because he had a studio visit with her and negatively like perceived. I don't think that he had particularly liked the fact that she was a medium. And so because of that, she stopped painting between 1908 and 1912. And I was like, that's kind of a wild thing to say without a citation that some, you know, man came into her studio and then she just quit painting because he had this negative impact. And so the most fascinating thing about it was, on the one hand, scholars were saying that that's why she stopped painting for these 4 years. And then there was a biographical discrepancy where other people were saying, oh, well, she actually stopped painting for these years because her mother went blind and she needed to care for her sick mother. But for both of these claims, there was no primary source documentation for where anyone found this. And so it just kept, over the time that people were writing about this alleged claim, it was becoming more sensationalized. And so that moment was what I wanted to investigate. And that's when I contacted the Hilma af Klint Foundation in Sweden to gain access to, they had digitized versions of her diaries and notebooks. And you know, Johann af Klint, the grandnephew of Hilma af Klint, was a really invaluable resource for me, as well as his niece, Hedvig Ersman. And at the time, it's very different now, but at the time, accessing those materials virtually was a really simple process. And because she hadn't exploded yet in the way that she had, from 2018 until now, and it's still going. But so I feel really lucky that I was able to do archival research. Unfortunately, I've been on the foundation's website now, and I find this really curious, and I'm going to keep my lips sealed on this one, but there's they state now on their website that they're unable to assist in research unless you're on the doctoral level. And I was doing a terminal master's at the time. So, say I was in the same position now, I wouldn't be able to do any of this work, which I find to be um, quite sad, actually, because there's plenty of good scholarship to be done on the master's level as well as the PhD level and even undergrad. So that's all I'm going to say about that.
That's rough, and that definitely connects with a lot of the issues that I have with academia and the accessibility of this material. And I mean, when I was in grad school in 2004 is when I started. It was just really hard to even like convince a professor to like okay like choosing this as a topic. Like if I wanted to study Helma of Klint and Theosophy, like to even like and at the undergraduate level, like forget about it. Right. And that's always been one of my interests as this esoteric studies kind of proliferates these days. But really how far have we gotten? So what's your sense? In the last 6 years, you're saying Hilma F. Klint studies is blowing up. Tell me more about your sense of that and whether there's receptivity for like a college student who wants to work on the esoteric stuff.
I Well, so this is one thing that I want to sort of say about like my relationship to Hilma Klint. I think that um I just I spent a long time, I think, paying close attention to the public reception of her in both Europe and um the United States. And I, even though there is a lot of good work that has come out about her, Julia Voss's biography on her is excellent and opened up, like totally new information, on Hilma Klint to anyone that was interested, like just spiritually, or if you're interested as a research practitioner, as an art historian, as someone in another discipline. And it was a really important book because it was all based on really deep archival research, which has often or had often been relatively absent in the work on her. Um, but I think that over the last probably 2 years, I kind of stopped reading all the stuff that was coming out about her in the mainstream, because as there's certainly ton of scholarship, from academics and others coming out about her, the mainstream public reception of her was just really off-putting to me. And it felt the very quick commodification of her felt incredibly upsetting to me as well. And as far as, whether or not I do think that there is more receptivity in academia, perhaps to those that are interested in esoteric studies. But I still believe that despite this kind of renaissance or this interest in the esoteric or the occult now, as it, it's like very popular, um, I still do think that in disciplinary art history, despite all of this sort of shifting perception and perspectives around, um, spirituality more broadly or esotericism, I still don't think that it's 100% fully accepted. I think that they've kind of like, I don't know, they're trying, but I still think that from some of the things that I've noticed, lots of art historians who in the past, for instance, um, were like, oh, spirituality is passé in modernism. We don't need to talk about the spiritual lives of modern artists. That's passé. Like we're just beyond that. That doesn't belong in modernity. Now they've kind of like shifted their tone a little bit because of this resurgence and this interest in the esoteric and how much attention is being drawn to these ideas and these new artists, and what's happening within institutional frameworks like canon formation, how Hilma Klint kind of exploded the canon, for instance. So there's lots of reimagining what the modernist canon looks like, and just superficial stuff too, like how much money these exhibitions bring in institutional frameworks like museums. So I feel like it's complicated, and I've largely seen my way out of it a little bit because it feels not it doesn't feel as good to me anymore, I don't think.
So that's a dark moment and gets me into, one of the reasons I asked you on here. Um, I mean, I'm finding, I've always been interested in the kind of confluence of like scholar and practitioner perspectives, right? And I've always been so excited in how, and I gave you the example that we could discuss of this idea of, is summoning a demon an appropriate classroom activity, right? I was at one of these conferences for Societas Magic, and we're talking about, methodologies and, the growing acceptance of esoteric studies. And this scholar just astonished me by saying, well, summoning a demon would not be an appropriate classroom activity. Uh, Please advise.
I just don't agree with that. And so I have a couple things to say. So first of all, I think that I mean, I know you said like, oh, that's a dark moment about my, it doesn't my relationship to Hilma of Clint not feeling as good. But, that doesn't mean that I have um, left my esoteric studies behind. That is still very much going. It's really just the Hilma of Clint thing that I kind of was like, all right, I think that my time with that has likely passed. I feel like, things come to you when they need to come to you. So we can talk about that later in the conversation. But as far as summoning demons, I think that really what it gets to is like this idea of like um like a perceived conflict between what is rational methodology of scholarly inquiry and that is subjective or emotional and spiritual nature of like practitioner perspectives. And I have you ever this when you were bringing this question up, this is what I thought about, but are you familiar with this book, Re-enchanting the Academy?
It rings a bell. I mean, I'm thinking of what Egil Asprem wrote, but that's a different.
Oh, that one's good too, but this one's different. It's called Re-enchanting the Academy, and it's okay, like the book is divided into four parts, I think. And in the second part, there's the second part of the book is about re-enchanting the curriculum. And there's an excellent article in this book by the scholar Julia Moore, and the title of her essay is On the Margins of the Academy, Seance, Sitter Groups, and Academics.
Hmm.
And what she's doing is in her article, she sort of explores this intersection of academic research and the practice of seances and spiritualism, particularly focusing on how these practices have been marginalized within the mainstream academia. And so she's really looking at this tension between like all, sorry, my watch is talking to me, alternative spiritual practices and what academia considers to be legitimate practices. And I think that one important thing that she's getting at is that she's really thinking about how scholars have treated certain practices with skepticism, if not outright dismissal, despite their popularity among intellectuals during certain historical periods. So I don't know if that's not really like an answer to your question necessarily, but I think what it does is it kind of sort of demonstrates that there's other people that are working in higher education that are exploring the practitioner experience and that want to fit that into the classroom as well, and that it does have relevancy and that it is important. And so it's just like so frustrating to think about, like, these allegedly like weak links, what methodologies count, what methodologies don't count, and that all this stuff was just created. So I don't see, I mean, did this person at the conference say why summoning a demon would not be appropriate?
I mean,
Can you elaborate on this?
it's like it goes without saying. Like that's my favorite part of it is that they didn't feel the need to explain why, right? It's like you know why,
But we
right?
don't know why. I don't know why. Like, I don't know why that would be. I mean, the only thing that I can imagine is that this person was, had some specific ideas. Yeah, it feels like very ideological or something to just be like, no.
I mean,
That's
because it's like I mean, I think of like the limit case would be like, well, we're gonna meditate in class. Like that
yeah.
just that feels so harmless and it's so clinical and it just seems like it's easy to understand, like we're gonna cast a horoscope in class. Sure. We're gonna turn over some tarot cards in class. Yeah, okay, sure, that makes sense. Like this is, we're gonna bring in some practitioner perspective, but we're gonna like read an incantation for summoning a demon all of a sudden, like here, we got to draw this red line, right? I wish that I had sort of pushed back on it more at the time, but it was more of a feeling of like I just can't even with this.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And so that brings me back to, what I wanted to title this discussion, The Scholar's Right to Refusal. And I remember being very disappointed when I saw that you wanted to stop the work with Hilma off Klint. It was so exciting that you had this access to the archive, right? It's like, this is so cool that you can do this. Like, I'm sure you must have found a bunch of really cool shit in there, but then when I realized the kind of like power of that move of just refusing, like, it doesn't feel good to be involved in this field that has, like, the values are not what you came into this with, the values of inquiry that you started approaching this. So, like, at what point does it start feeling bad, and do we have the right to kind of give it up?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you do have the right to give it up. And like this is one thing actually that I feel like is really important to kind of uh elucidate as far as my work with Hilma off Klint, because Hilma off Klint, although you know, although I'm very just completely enchanted by this woman, Hilma af Klint was always a case study in a much larger art historical problem that I was looking at. And that was one of, this sort of absence of spirituality in textbook narratives, um, around the lives of modern artists, like why were we not talking about um these extraordinary experiences that people were having, and why don't we talk about the subjective lives of artists more often, and why is this something that has been regarded as anti-intellectual or um like ridiculous, or, you're going to get laughed out of the room if you're a serious academic and this is what you're studying. Why is that the case? And so those were sort of my main interest, was really sort of like intellectual history, like why are these particular topics erased from the historical record? And when Hilma af Klint came along, she was just like the perfect case study, because she encompassed so many different things, from being a spiritualist to being a theosophist to being an anthroposophist to being a Lutheran to just like all of these things, just an incredible human. And the academic art world was just like completely swayed by her, and all of a sudden she was capable of, whether it was even on a superficial level, like she was capable of influencing people in a really deep way to really question some of the deep assumptions that they were making about the field. And that felt incredibly important, but I still felt like there was a lot of stuff that was missing. And so I was really dedicated to that work, but you know, I I felt like I have so many other interests, and one thing that I'm currently working on, and this will likely be the last thing that I do seriously on Hilma af Klint, is um I myself and I think maybe 9 or 10 other um, art historians and research practitioners, we were invited to contribute chapters to a forthcoming edited volume on Swedish women modernists. And this is going to be a while. It's like in process. Um, but my chapter that I'm writing for this book is titled Beyond Canonical Abstraction, Hilma Klint's work as a call for methodological reform. And I feel like part of me is just going to use this chapter to really say a lot of the things that I've been, I think, vocal about for a long time, but to really streamline it and, have it contribute, like have a contribution in a real meaningful way, and then just kind of be like, all right, that's done. But what this is kind of like, maybe not necessarily a synchronicity, but um, one of the things that I was doing when I was conducting archival research was I was looking at the automatic drawings produced by her and her seance group, the five in particular. So I was doing a visual analysis of, like, I think it was close to 250 automatic drawings. And um, I really tried to dissect these drawings as much as I possibly could. And a lot of um, the time that I spent studying those drawings actually has informed a really big art history project I've been working on for 5 years on automatic drawings and plant human entanglement. So, there's just interesting how um, other projects have evolved out of this thing that possessed me for so long, that some other really sort of amazing thing developed from doing that research as well, that doesn't have anything to do with Hilma af Klint explicitly, but it came from my relationship to her and her seance group. So, like, I feel like you just kind of have to know when to tap out, or when something doesn't feel like it's really serving you anymore. Like, if it doesn't feel like, if you don't feel good about the work that you're doing, I think that that's something that needs to be, like, looked at, you know.
Tell me more about the archival research process. How do you approach it? What have you learned about it? And especially in terms of these questions about like the interventions that we want to do, these methodological issues, like how does the opportunity of accessing an archive sort of play in here?
I mean, I guess that really depends on the type of work that you're doing. So with me, because of my early work on Hilma af Klint and this biographical discrepancy that I had seen in the secondary literature. So, that, like, oh, she quit painting for 4 years because of Steina. No, she quit painting for 4 years because her mother was blind. And because there was no citation or primary source, I had to kind of go back in a lot of into a lot of literature. And then, I kind of found the precise moment where that statement came from and how it became sensationalized. And then, that was just like the traditional, like, close reading, what people do when they're working on a big research project. But I wanted to also explore that situation in a new way. And that's when I conducted the archival research with that particular time period in mind. So I think I had requested archival materials from like 1906 to 1914, because I was looking at that year of oh, she stopped painting between 1908 and 1912. And so I wanted to see what was going on prior to that, prior to 1908, and then shortly after 1912. And that's why I wanted to work with the archive to look at what kind of work she was producing before and after this alleged encounter with Steina that upset her so badly, apparently. So, it just kind of depends on what your research question is and the time period that you're looking at. I'm doing another big archival trip early in April, actually, in the UK. And that's going to be more of a sort of free form archival research trip. I mean, I know what it is that I'm looking for, but it's not going to be as streamlined, I don't think, as the Hilma Klint stuff.
So automatic writing, that sounds like something you don't have a whole lot of galleries and books like full of it. Is it difficult to access?
So I'm going to the Society for Psychical Research in Cambridge. So I'm going to be using their archives. I've been in contact with them in the past. I've been trying to plan this trip for a while. And so some of the stuff that I'm looking at not just automatic drawings, but also text. So people that wrote about their their personal narrative of spirit art or their family's personal narrative of engaging with spirits of the dead and how they came to produce drawings. And um, there are actually, oddly, there has been um, over the last several years, there has been kind of a like keen interest all of a sudden in the art world to like the ecological imagination or the role that plants play in consciousness or etc. But there isn't really any research that's being done on what I'm looking at on plant human entanglement in these seance drawings. And there are some galleries actually in New York City that focus primarily on personally I hate to use this term, but like art brut or outsider art, where a lot of their private collection deals with spirit art in particular, or people that were producing, visual visual art through the, through mediumship. So there's stuff out there. You just have to dig. You have to dig deep.
You can't just sort of like do a Google image search and look at a whole bunch of automatic writing.
They're actually they're on what is it called? Hold on, let me see if I can find it really quick. They're okay, yeah, here it is. So this is actually a pretty intense resource, for all things spiritualism, if anyone is, any listeners are interested. But it's called it's excuse me, iapsop.com, and it's the International Association for the Preservation of Spiritualist and Occult Periodicals. And it is just a treasure trove of um, tons of periodicals, and within these periodicals you can find like personalized accounts with mediums or spirit art or all kinds of stuff on Rosicrucianism. I mean, it just goes on forever. You can find all kinds of wild stuff on auras or um, interesting books on by like scientists on botanical life, and there's just a ton of stuff. You just do a search and it'll pull up a whole bunch of stuff for you. But and then there's just university archives too, like Beinecke Rare Books Library, or there's tons of archives that have lots of digitized material, but I'm more interested in anonymous. uh, like nobody that is necessarily being exhibited. I'm just curious about some, some random family in England in like 1867 whose family experienced, was in communication with their deceased son for 7 years, and the wife produced tons of automatic drawing. I'm just more interested in this, the anonymous kind of experience, like lesser known individuals that were engaging with spirits and, producing these images that have tons of botanical or plant life within these drawings.
So you mentioned Terence McKenna earlier, and I'm curious
Yeah.
to know more about the inspiration of McKenna. Obviously, McKenna is like the plant guy, right? So does his work inform your approach here?
I actually love Terence McKenna and Rupert Sheldrake and Dennis McKenna. Like I love all those guys. But I'm going to tell you a funny story about my relationship to Terence McKenna. Um, this is a very true story, but I I've read some Terence McKenna books and like conversations that he's had with other like psychonauts and just wild guys in the field. And but so for several years I had this tendency to only listen to Terence McKenna lectures if I couldn't sleep. So if it was 2 o'clock in the morning, I would put on a Terence McKenna lecture, and his voice is incredibly bizarre. And that would put me to sleep. And so I would be listening to a Terence McKenna lectures while I was sleeping, which feels like the only way you should be listening to Terence McKenna lectures, actually. And then if I woke up, there would be some other guy talking about like Jewish mysticism or like the Kabbalah or something bizarre happening. And so I listened to most Terence McKenna lectures while sleeping, and also while under the influence. And those are basically the only times that I've engaged with Terence McKenna lectures, like as he's speaking, outside of just reading some books. That's my So he's just deep in my subconscious somewhere.
That seems like the way to go about it. Do you want to talk about triadic intimacy?
Oh,
So in terms of the conversation we're having about let me see, what is it? Seeing relationally rather than hierarchically. You say on the back of this book, you kind of invite the reader to think about the possibility of living without form. Tell me about form.
wow, that's so funny because I'm writing another novella right now. Currently, it's in process, that is all I'm going to say about it right now is that it is as just as much about anti-form as it is a formalism of horror, basically. So when I think of, I mean, form in the context of triadic intimacy, um, I was thinking really explicitly on the form of this, like the human form, and really how um, to transcend physicality on all levels. And so, in the context of triadic intimacy, I was thinking about um, the form of the body and living in this flesh, basically, and how to really like absolve myself of that form to just become pure energy, basically.
And where are you at with that? How's
I'm
that?
feeling pretty good about it. Unfortunately, I can't stop feeling my body, the aging body that we're living in. But I feel like, um, I think that a lot of things that not just with triadic, but also this new novella that I'm working on, I seem to have a particular interest to writing from the inside out. So trying to, um, really play around and toy with the interior. And that interior ends up just completely consuming the external form to the point of it's almost like, becomes nothing, like it just becomes non-existent. So you're just existing as like matter, basically. Like, um, so that's kind of where I currently am.
Anything else you want to say about other projects you're working on? I'm afraid I may be running out of steam here.
Um, no, I think I mentioned a couple things like um the chapter for the book on Swedish women modernists and I think that the thing that I'm most excited about really is the current novella that I'm writing, and also as far as the plant stuff, I've been really exploring the expression of plants in automatic drawings, trying to blend like insights from art history and critical plant studies and theoretical physics. And so the plan is to develop that into a full-length monograph, but I'm presenting a paper on this topic in April at the Association for Art History annual conference in um, the UK, to be held at the University of York, and I'm super excited about it. And I'm presenting in a session on art esotericism and the ecological imagination at an art history conference. And I'm really pumped about that because that seems really like I don't know, like I'm just excited that art history is having a session on that in particular. So, and that seems to be coming up a lot at art history conferences. So that could be a really positive thing.
So this is a great relief and greatly encouraging to me, because my understanding was that you had practically given up on this Hilma of Klint project. And despite having discovered, I'm sure, all kinds of cool stuff in the archives, my question is, does this stuff ever get written up? Does this stuff ever get out there? Like, is this stuff that you learned even accessible? You know what I mean?
Oh, her archival material stuff?
Yeah.
I mean, outside of what people have, gained permission to publish in books, like exhibition catalogs or their papers or articles. Um, no, I mean, it's not, the archive is just not publicly accessible, which honestly, seeing as it's all digitized, I mean, I don't know. There's a world of possibility there, but the foundation is also it's run by the family and it's really small, and there's a lot of there's a lot of things that are going on with the archive, and the family and um, that foundation. I think there's a lot of interesting things that have come up in recent years about some conflicts that's floating around out there on the internet. So
So is it a situation like Jung's Red Book where there is all this cool material that is just sort of locked up and can't get out there?
I don't know. I don't know if I would think about it that way. I think that um when I was finishing grad school, I actually tried to apply for a Fulbright scholarship to go to Stockholm for a year. And those are incredibly competitive scholarships. And I didn't get it. But what I was wanting to do was to work with the digitized archival materials and try to start putting together um, like a database where all of this could be publicly accessed. I mean, I was basically just offering to give them like tons of free labor. um, because I felt like, and I still feel that um, it's just really important information that should be accessible or more easily accessible. But that's also a really complicated and long-term project for someone to, rephotograph all of these images or rescan all of these thousands and thousands and thousands of handwritten pages and typed pages. And then there's also like a translation issue where all of the archival materials are written in Swedish and some German. So there's also a language barrier. So, I can only hope that one day that project will be taken on, and sometime down the road, people will have access to these materials to look more closely at her life.
It just breaks my heart. It seems like such a scandal that there's all this cool material in there
I
that
know.
just can't even
And
look.
now you can't touch it unless you're actively engaged in a doctoral program. So
Right, you got to have that
gatekeepers of
PhD.
knowledge.
Oh, that's a gatekeeping situation. Emily Leon, thank you for coming on the show. I've had a blast. It's been a long time coming.
I know. Thanks for having me.
All best wishes, and I will look forward to following when you do these cool presentations and, to be continued.
Cool.
Right
Thanks.
on.
Have a good night.
Yeah, you too.